Hello, everybody. Welcome back to AP World History with Luna, with your host, Mr. Ansharsky. This is the second chapter of our first unit. Today, we're going to kind of continue building on those ideas we introduced in China. We're going to see how Chinese influences, how they are going to impact other societies in East Asia, namely Korea, Vietnam, and of course, Japan. Your bell work on the screen, obviously. So yes, today we are engaging, that's chapter 2, by the way. Well, let me fix that real quick, actually. What are you talking about? It was always chapter 2. Yes, so we are continuing that second point on topic 1.1, and we are going to potentially explore the effects of Chinese cultural traditions on East Asia. So we already looked at this in China, but let's look at it in the context of other societies. But the real big word to introduce today is something known as Sinification. Sinification describes the adoption of certain aspects of Chinese culture into a society. And you can kind of see that in this map right here. This represents countries who have historically been influenced by Chinese linguistic tradition, meaning that they have similar Chinese characters, or kind of basically letters in a sense. So China will have extreme and strong cultural ties to a lot of these societies across East Asia, thanks to its dominance politically and economically. And speaking on that economic point, the diffusion or spread of Chinese traditions is largely going to be a result of trade and diplomatic relations, as we will see. So China is going to be a major cultural influence on places such as the Korean Peninsula, such as Japan, such as Southeast Asia in general. But let's take a look at Japan real quick. We're going to cover kind of just the basic history of Japan, and then we'll look at how Japan will form a society largely in reaction to Chinese influence. But as usual, let's start with geography. Let's start with geography. Well, as you might already be familiar with, Japan is a series of several islands, the biggest of which is this one right here of Honshu. But the terrible thing about living on an island is that there's limited amount of farmland and there's limited amount of natural resources. And that's going to have the two impacts on Japanese history. For one thing, we are going to see that because of this lack of arable or farmable land, we are going to see essentially many kingdoms pop up all over the Japanese mainland, all over the Japanese island of Honshu. And these small territories are largely going to be organized based on family or clan loyalty. So we have families in charge of small plots of land. We are going to see a very powerful aristocracy or nobility in Japanese history. The other thing about Japan being an island is that it needs to trade. It needs to get its stuff from outside places. And that will impact its relationship with China, but it'll also impact Japan's place in the 20th century. But we'll get there in like Unit 7, so don't worry. But because of this very fragmented idea that organization is based on clan loyalty around limited farmland, Japan is what we call a decentralized civilization. There will be a similar culture that's shared among these Japanese societies. However, for much of Japanese history, it's largely going to be a decentralized political structure. By the 300s, there is going to be a family, the Yamato clan. They're going to establish the imperial system in Japan. But the emperor, as we're going to see, doesn't have a lot of political power. The emperor is more accurately described as a figurehead, as a religious leader who doesn't hold significant political power. And that's because of this dominance of the nobility, of the aristocracy in Japanese society. So Japan is really going to be a fragmented civilization, one in which there isn't a single unifying political voice. There are attempts, of course, as we can see with an emperor. But the emperor, as we're going to see, doesn't have a lot of power. So the emperors of Japan, they are going to try and correct this fact that they don't have a lot of power. They are going to introduce several reforms known as the Taika Reforms. And the Taika Reforms are very much inspired by the Chinese. They're inspired by the Chinese political system of centralized government, of a government in which all power is in the hands of, well, one person. So we see here that there is an attempt by the emperor to gain more power. We will see the emperor build up a bureaucracy, or at least attempt to. And we're also seeing how the Taika reforms are also leading to the spread of Chinese architectural influence. So the Taika reforms is a time period in which Japanese society will adopt certain political aspects from China, a centralized emperor figure. It will adopt artistic influences. You can kind of see that in this picture right here. It's also going to adopt cultural and architectural practices as well. We see that best expressed with the imperial capital in Japan of Nara, which is actually based on the imperial city in Japan, or excuse me, in China, in Chang'an. So the Taika reforms, that's when we are seeing the bulk of all of these Chinese influences coming into Japan. Japanese language is going to be largely based, especially its written language, on the characters that are developed in Chinese language. However, we are going to see that there is going to be the rejection of this centralized system. And largely that's going to be because of these figures known as the nobles, known as the aristocrats. They are going to reject this attempt by the Japanese emperors to centralize their power. So the bureaucracy is largely going to be undermined. The power of this centralized emperor is largely going to be undermined by Japanese aristocrats. So these Japanese aristocrats are going to be heavily against encouraging Chinese influence in their society, both politically, but also culturally as well. Anything that smells of Chinese more than likely means aristocrats will have to give up their power, so that's why they're going to be so gosh dang opposed to it. And this opposition to the Chinese influences in Japan is going to begin a period of Japanese history known as the Haiyan Period. And the Haiyan Period is going to see, basically, the power of the emperor significantly decrease. We're also going to see the kind of purging, if you will, of certain aspects of Chinese culture in Japanese society. And we're going to actually see that begin with the expulsion of Chinese diplomats in Japan. So the Haiyan period is really going to be a time period of opposition to Chinese cultural influence, this Sinification process. And largely that's because of the dominance of the aristocracy, of the nobility. They are opposed to the emperor getting more power, and that means reject Chinese political influence. So as a result of all of this reaction against centralization, we're going to see the power of the emperor significantly decrease. The emperor in Japanese society is largely a religious figurehead, at least at this point. He is the embodiment of ideas of Shintoism, which is the native Japanese religion. And because the emperor really doesn't have a lot of political power, they're still around. So what are they going to do with their spare time? Well, they're going to become investors. They're going to become patrons, you could say, of art. And since anything that smells Chinese, anything that is remotely similar to Chinese is discouraged, this is a time period in which we do see the promotion of Japanese culture. So its initial origins are based on Chinese culture. But because of this opposition to Chinese influences, we're going to start to see that branch out into more unique expressions of Japanese culture. And we're going to look at some of those later on today. But that includes the adoption of new Japanese characters, new Japanese letters in their language. So Japanese culture is really going to flourish during this time that is in opposition to China. But politically speaking, we are going to see the development of a new form of organization on the Japanese island that reflects the decreased power of the emperor. And that is the system of Japanese feudalism. And we're going to discuss feudalism in Europe. We've already discussed it a little bit in the pre-classical period. But essentially, Japanese feudalism works like this. The emperor is there, religious figurehead, lives in the palace, doesn't do much else. But the people who have the real power are the different states across Japan. And these states, these countries, they're ruled over by members of the aristocracy. They're ruled over by warlords known as the Bushi. And the Bushi essentially make up their own government. But they are able to provide a structure by adopting this model of feudalism. So the Bushi, they are going to have samurai. They are going to have troops that are given land in exchange for military service. And on this land live peasants, live what we call serfs. Serfs are peasants, are farmers that don't have to leave the farm. They are legally allowed to leave a land owned by a noble. So the serfs essentially provide this unpaid labor in exchange for protection by the samurai, but we are essentially seeing this decentralized political model in Japanese society. And again, it's a reaction against these efforts by the emperor to adopt Chinese political centralization. So the impact of feudalism is going to be a few-fold. For one thing, the emperor's power is severely decreased, as you can imagine. Power is delegated, given to lower nobles. We're also going to see, because of this model of feudalism, that political power is based on land and having land. Therefore, we are going to see increased fighting across the Japanese islands. We are going to see periods of civil war. We are going to see extreme violence across feudal Japan. We're going to see the building of castles, as you can see down here. And one of the clans that is going to dominate this Haiyan period is going to be the Fujiwara clan. They are going to kind of establish themselves as the premier military force in Japan. And they are trying to gain legitimacy by marrying into the imperial family. So the imperial family doesn't have any political power again, but it does have that religious significance. But Japanese feudalism is going to become a little bit more complicated because of this intense instability. There is going to be calls for a more, not completely centralized government, but a more organized and structured one. And we're going to see that best expressed through a new political system known as the shogunate. So a shogunate is a government ruled over by a shogun. And the shogun is a military commander who then delegates land and power to his supporters, to these bushi, who are also known as daimyo. So the shogunate as a system is going to emerge during this so-called Genpei Wars. It's going to be a time period in feudal Japan in which there's intense infighting between these clans. And eventually a certain clan rises to the top. It's the Minamoto clan. And this clan is going to establish the shogunate. And they become the shoguns. They are going to become the military leaders that, in theory, have unified all of Japan. But to administer this new united Japan, you're going to see really that system of feudalism continue. The emperor is still there. It's a religious figurehead position, not a real thing, really. The guy in charge is the shogun, and he's going to give power out to the daimyo, to the bushi, who then have their troops being the samurai, who then own land that is worked by the serfs, by the peasants. And we call this period in which the Minamoto clan rules over Japan. This is the Kamakura Shogunate. So the shogunate is a form of political organization that we're going to see a lot in Japanese history, that we'll see a few times, I should say, in Japanese history. But it's a decentralized political model in which the emperor doesn't have any power, remember, opposition to Chinese political influence, but also we have the supremacy of Japanese aristocrats, the daimyo, or also known as the bushi for our purposes. So let's look at the emergence of Japanese culture. We looked at the political system. That's a reaction again to Chinese influences. Let's look at Japanese culture. Because while Japanese culture is distinct, obviously, from Chinese culture, there is going to be some influences that do carry over even after attempts are made to eliminate Chinese influences. Because for one thing, Japanese popular religious tradition is going to be a blend of native religion, of Shintoism, but also of the kind of Chinese interpretation of Buddhism. As we're going to discuss in our third chapter, Buddhism will spread into China and take on its own form, and then from China, that Buddhism will spread to places like Japan. So Buddhism is going to be pretty popular in Japanese society, but it's going to blend in with native Japanese influences as well. And we're going to also see the emergence of a distinct Japanese language. Japanese characters, i.e. letters, they are based on Chinese, but they are going to become more distinct and more separate as time goes on. And eventually we will see the earliest instances of Japanese literature that reflects this new Japanese language. And one of the earliest is the Tale of Genji, which is produced at the imperial court during this Haiyan period. In terms of visual art, we are going to see similarity in basic style. And we can see a picture of Japanese art right here. This is a nature scene that is very similar to Chinese visual art. It's also black and white. It's done in ink. Also a representation of this influence of Chinese culture. But we also see the influence of the importance of calligraphy in Japanese culture. We do see a similarity between these two societies. But we're also going to see an adoption of certain elements of Chinese philosophy as well, especially in Confucianism. Confucianism isn't going to be adopted through a civil service exam, but rather this idea that there has to be a natural hierarchy, that there has to be a patriarchy, there has to be respect for one's superiors. This is popular in Japanese elite culture. So that's a similarity as well between China and Japan. But much like we're seeing the decentralization politically of Japanese society, we also see it economically speaking. So even though Japan will cut off formal diplomatic relations with China, we do see that trade still continues, and that is bringing in more Chinese culture. That's bringing in Chinese inventions like gunpowder. It's bringing in Chinese paper-making techniques. It's bringing in silk. So China still remains an important cultural neighbor to the Japanese. But that decentralized economic system is best expressed through the guild system. And a guild, as we'll talk about more with Europe, essentially is a group of people who share a similar job. So let's just say there's a teachers guild. So these are all teachers. I'm not going to date myself by naming current teachers at UHS, but these are all teachers who get together And they set the standard of what it means to be a teacher, of what you have to, what instruction you have to give, your style of teaching. But more realistically and more historically, they would be expressed in things like blacksmith guilds. For instance, a blacksmith, all of them would get together, they would list out a process on how to be a blacksmith. And in order to become one, you have to pass these guild standards. So there's not government interference of the economy, much like we see in China. So we do have this very decentralized political and economic system in Japan. So with this question right here, consider the ways in which Japan is adopting Chinese culture, but consider also how Japan is rejecting it as well in favor of making its own thing. So let's turn our attention now to the Korean Peninsula and to Vietnam. Well, let's start with Korea. Korea is eventually going to be unified. It starts out as an initial period of decentralized clan-based kingdoms, but eventually they're going to be unified by the 600s, by the 670s. However, unlike Japan, Korea is geographically linked to China insofar as they're on the same continent, and they are not separated by any bodies of water. So as such, there's going to be a lot closer of a connection between Korea and Japan. And it's going to be expressed through continuous diplomatic relations. So during the Tang Dynasty, we are going to see the Korean Peninsula being used as a sort of tribute state. We are going to see that the Tang are demanding the Koreans pay tribute. And this is going to have the impact of continuously allowing for trade and diplomatic relations between Chinese dynasties and the Korean Peninsula. And these diplomats and these traders, these merchants, they're bringing with them Chinese cultural influences. And we're going to look at how that influences Korean society in a second. But eventually, as the Tang go away, as the Song move down south, we do see a breaking off of diplomatic relations. And from that, we start to see more unique Korean culture emerge. Goryeo, or Korea, is going to be this unified kingdom on the Korean Peninsula that does have strong cultural links to China. And we definitely see that in the expression of how the ruling family, the imperial family in Goryeo, adopts ideas of Confucianism and Chinese political thought. So we are going to see in Korea a more willing adaptation to Chinese cultural influences. We see the building of Confucian temples and shrines. But we're also seeing the adoption of Confucian ideas of education, of Confucian ideas of law, Confucian ideas of gender roles and gender relations. We're also going to see, unlike in Japan and unlike in Vietnam, the adoption of that civil service exam and the bureaucracy based on Confucian values. So Confucianism is big in Korea. Buddhism, much like in Japan, will spread there because of trade with China and will take on its own kind of its own local traditions. So we are seeing a more willing adoption of Chinese culture in Korea because of these strong diplomatic ties initially formed during the Tang Dynasty. But let's contrast Korea with Vietnam. Vietnam, much like the Korean Peninsula, initially is going to start out as a series of clan-based kingdoms. So this is a similarity, you could say, between all these states. They are going to have, at least initially, a series of clan-based kingdoms. But Vietnam is really divided between two parts, between the north and between the south. Well, we'll talk about that in the 20th century, don't you worry. I hate myself. All right, so in the north, we do kind of see these clans really have a decentralized political system. And that's going to be kind of shaken up because of the invasion by the Tang Dynasty. The Tang are going to turn northern Vietnam into the imperial province of Annam. And Annam is going to witness the kind of forceful presence of Chinese political and cultural influence. On the one hand, we have the Chinese installing order there by having a provincial governor. But we're also going to see ideas from China being adopted by more elite members of Vietnamese society, by the collaborators, those working with the Chinese. However, among aristocrats who are opposed to this centralization, among aristocrats who are opposed to these collaborators, we are going to see that there's a culture of resisting and rejecting Chinese cultural influence. So we do see this very strong culture of resistance opposed to Chinese cultural influences. That's not to say that Chinese cultural influences won't make their way into Vietnamese society. We see that with the early Vietnamese language. We see that with some adoption of Confucian ideas of hierarchy. We see that with the spread of Buddhism. But we do see a unique Vietnamese culture emerging, largely reacting against this invasion by the Chinese. And eventually, the Chinese, they are going to leave. Vietnam gets its independence. They form the kingdom in the north known as Dai Viet. However, during this time, despite the fact that we are seeing this unique Vietnamese culture emerge, there are still problems that will weaken the political unity and thus leave Vietnam open to outside invaders by the 19th century. And that's because we have this very dominant nobility in Vietnam, much like we saw in Japan. So let's turn our attention now to the south, to the kingdom of Champa. And we've actually already looked at Champa before. We looked at the introduction of Champa rice into China. And Champa is going to be a bit more politically unified. And it's not ever going to be invaded by the Chinese. And as such, we are going to see a unique culture emerge that's not necessarily imposed on them by the Chinese. Rather, Champa is going to be notable for being involved in the Indian Ocean and the Chinese sea trade. So we do see Chinese influences making their way into South Vietnam, but it's blending together with other influences, influences from India, influences from Malaysia, from Malay, influences from Muslim merchants. So Vietnamese culture in the South, while it does have some aspects of Chinese culture, it's not going to be distinctly and completely influenced by China. So you should be able to compare and contrast how Korea and Vietnam responded to Chinese cultural influence. And then this is just some similarities and differences between Vietnam and Korea and Japan. Well, all these places do have rice agriculture in some form. We do see that Confucianism, especially the idea of hierarchy, is going to be adopted by these societies. We do see that nobles and aristocrats are somewhat important in all these places. We know that Buddhism will spread into these places thanks to trade with China or occupation in the case of northern Vietnam. And we also know that Chinese language is influential in these societies. I got thirsty. The difference, however, is in who will centralize. Korea will centralize, Japan and Vietnam will not. Not everyone is going to have those direct diplomatic or military relations with China, i.e. Japan doesn't. We're not going to see the civil service exam everywhere. We just see it in Korea. But we do see how there is some pushback depending on the society. We're seeing that in Japan. We're also seeing that in Vietnam. So you should think about similarities and differences, but these are some general ones. I haven't included everything. So have a great day. This is the end of today's presentation. Yeah, that's it. All right. Too many cooks, too many. Sorry, I watched that video again today. It's It still holds up. Cannot show that in class. There's too much violence. All right, have a great day. Bye, guys.